welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, we return, yet again, to the Valley of Earl and the King of Elflands' daughter. In this episode, the two plots have begun to diverge. One of the plots, following Alvaric, is full of useful material for Ars Magica. The other one, following his son Orion, less so. But we're so far in, it would be strange to start using excerpts. So we'll just carry on with the full text. Once again, thanks to Michelle Fry and all the LibriVoxes for the audio recording that we're using.
Chapter 10, The Ebbing of Elfland. Next morning, Alvaric came up to the tower to the witch Zerundarel, weary and frantic from searching all night long in strange places for Lyrazel. All night he had tried to guess what fancy had beckoned her out and whither it might have led her. He had searched by the stream by which she had prayed to the stones, and the pool where she prayed to the stars. He had called her name up every tower, and had called it wide in the dark, and had had no answer but echo. And so he had come at last to the witch Zerundarel.
There might be fairy or magic auras in these two spots. In standard Ars cosmology there would not be, but they are emotionally tied places that a lesser fairy might inhabit as stories about them spread.
"Whither?" he said, saying no more than that the boy might not know his fears. Yet Orion knew. And Zerundarel all mournfully shook her head. "The way of the leaves," she said, "the way of all beauty." But Alvaric did not stay to hear her say more than her first 5 words, for he went with the restlessness with which he had come, straight from the room and hastily down the stair, and out at once into the windy morning to see which way those glorious leaves were gone. And a few leaves that had clung to cold branches longer, when the gay company of their comrades had gone, were now too on the air, going lonely and last, and Alvaric saw they were going southeast towards Elfland. Hurriedly he then donned his magical sword in its wide scabbard of leather, and with scanty provisions hastened over the fields after the last of the leaves, whose autumnal glory led him, as many a cause in its latter days, all splendid and fallen, leads all manner of men. And so he came to the upland fields with their grass all gray with dew, and the air was all sparkling with sunlight, and gay with the last of the leaves, but a melancholy seemed to dwell with the sound of the lowing of cattle. In the calm bright morning, with the northwest wind roaming through it, Alvaric came by no calm, and never gave up the haste of one who has lost something suddenly. He had the swift movements of such, and the frantic air. He watched all day over clear, wide horizons, southeast where the leaves were leading, and at evening he looked to see the elfin mountains, severe and changeless, unlit by any light we know, the color of pale forget-me-nots. He held on restlessly to see their summits, but never they came to view. And then he saw the house of the old leather worker who had made the scabbard for his sword, and the sight of it brought back to him the years that were gone since the evening when first he had seen it, although he never knew how many they were, and could not know, for no one has ever devised any exact calculation whereby to estimate the action of time in Elfland. Then he looked once more for the pale blue elfin mountains, remembering well where they lay, in their long grave row, past a point of one of the leather worker's gables, but he saw never a line of them. Then he entered the house, and the old man still was there. The leather worker was wonderfully aged. Even the table on which he worked was much older. He greeted Alvaric, remembering who he was, and Alvaric inquired for the old man's wife. "She died long ago," he said, and again Alvaric felt the baffling flight of those years, which added a fear to Elfland whither he went. Yet he neither thought to turn back, nor reined for a moment his impatient haste. He said a few formal things of the old man's loss that had happened so long ago. Then, "Where are the elfin mountains?" he asked, "the pale blue peaks?"
The mountains have been withdrawn because the king and the land are coterminal. The king has pulled himself back from the mortal world, so the entry vanishes and the mundane land beneath is visible.
A look came slowly over the old man's face, as though he had never seen them, as though Alvaric, being learned, spoke of something that the old leather worker could not know. No, he did not know, he said. And Alvaric found that today, as all those years ago, this old man still refused to speak of Elfland. Well, the boundary was only a few yards away. He would cross it and ask the way of elfin creatures, if he could not see the mountains to guide him then. The old man offered him food, and he had not eaten all day, but Alvaric, in his haste, only asked him once more of Elfland, and the old man humbly said that of such things he knew nothing.
Is this man a border guardian? Regardless, the king has not only withdrawn Elfland, but the memory of Elfland. That's not how these things usually work in Ars Magica. For us, this would imply that the man was already in the edge of the fairy realm, and that as the realm was pulled back, he lost some of his fantastical qualities.
Then Alvaric strode away and came to the field he knew, which he remembered to be divided by the nebulous border of twilight. And indeed he had no sooner come to the field than he saw all the toadstools leaning over one way, and that the way he was going. For just as thorn trees all lean away from the sea, so toadstools and every plant that has any touch of mystery, such as foxgloves, mulleins, and certain kinds of orchis, when growing anywhere near it, all lean towards Elfland.
This is a lovely bit of folklore that characters with fairy lore may know. We discussed orchis and foxglove in previous episodes, but mullions are new. They're used to make torches and wicks. They're called hag's tapers, because witches use them for potions and for torches. Simultaneously, the light from a hag's taper is thought to dispel demons. That's a useful wood for magic items, as it has links to Ignum, Vim, and Rigo.
By this one may know, before one has heard a murmur of waves, or before one has guessed an influence of magical things, that one comes, as the case may be, to the sea or the border of Elfland. And in the air above him Alvaric saw golden birds, and guessed that there had been a storm in Elfland, blowing them over the border from the southeast, though a northwest wind blew over the fields we know. He went on, but the boundary was not there, and he crossed the field as any field we know, and still he had not come to the fells of Elfland.
Many migratory birds go to Elfland during the winter. If you're looking for a Bjorna with a strong fairy tinge, one of the great migratory birds could be suitable.
Then Alvaric pressed on with a new impatience, with the northwest wind behind him, and the earth began to grow bare and shingly and dull, without flowers, without shade, without color, with none of those things that there are in remembered lands, by which we build pictures of them when we are there no more. It was all disenchanted now. Alvaric saw the golden bird high up, rushing away to the southeast, and he followed his flight, hoping soon to see the mountains of Elfland, which he supposed to be merely concealed by some magical mist. But still the autumnal sky was bright and clear, and all the horizon plain, and still there came never a gleam of the elfin mountains. And not from this did he learn that Elfland had ebbed, but when he saw on that desolate shingly plain, untorn by the northwest wind, but blooming fair in the autumn, a May-tree that he remembered a long while since, all white with blossoms that once rejoiced a spring day far in his childhood, then he knew that Elfland had been there, and must have receded, although he knew not how far. For it is true, and Alvaric knew, that just as the glamour that brightens much of our lives, especially in early years, comes from rumors that reach us from Elfland by various messengers, on whom be blessings and peace, so there returns from our fields to Elfland again, to become a part of its mystery, all manner of little memories that we have lost, and little devoted toys that were treasured once. And this is part of the law of ebb and flow that science may trace in all things. Thus light grew the forest of coal, and the coal gives back light. Thus rivers fill the sea, and the sea sends back to the rivers. Thus all things give that receive, even death.
In this cosmology, as you enter Fairy, things you have lost come back to you. I'd argue that items to which you have a strong connection, such as an arcane connection, are the most likely to be found. Are these real objects or facsimiles generated from the memories of the human? For the object, this does not matter so much, but can you create fairy copies of living people, or even fairy copies of the beloved dead?
Next, Alveric saw lying there on the flat, dry ground a toy that he yet remembered, which years and years ago, how could he say how many, had been a childish joy to him, crudely carved out of wood, and one unlucky day it had been broken, and one unhappy day it had been thrown away. And now he saw it lying there, not merely new and unbroken, but with a wonder about it, a splendor and a romance, the radiant, transfigured thing that his young fancy had known. It lay there forsaken of Elfland, as wonderful things of the sea lie sometimes desolate on wastes of sand, when the sea is a far blue bulk with a border of foam.
I like the imagery here of fairy washing back your personal treasures, much as the sea disgorges shells and wonders. Can this be predictably used by Marinita Magi? Can they reverse the process, doing the equivalent of throwing a message in a bottle in the ocean? Given the fairy propensity to complete stories, the likelihood of these bottles being lost seems far lower than in the uncaring sea. Places where these things predictably work might be under an unnatural law. I love this as a Covenant concept. I realize it's basically the where the spare socks go idea, which I've used before, but because it's tied to people and their emotional needs, it's less an economic resource than a story hook.
Dreary with lost romance was the plain from which Elfland had gone, though here and there Alveric saw again and again those little forsaken things that had been lost from his childhood, dropping through time to the ageless and hourless region of Elfland to be a part of its glory, and now left forlorn by this immense withdrawal. Old tunes, old songs, old voices hummed there too, growing fainter and fainter, as though they could not live long in the fields we know.
This is a personalized wasteland. It's filled with things he loved, which are returned to him, so that he can watch them die.
And when the sun set, a mauve rose glow in the east, that Alveric fancied a little too gorgeous for earth, led him onward still, for he deemed it to be the reflection cast on the sky by the glow of the splendor of Elfland. So he went on hoping to find it, horizon after horizon, and night came on with all earth's comrade stars, and only then Alveric put aside at last that frantic restlessness that had driven him since the morning, and wrapping himself in a loose cloak that he wore, ate such food as he had in the satchel, and slept a troubled sleep alone with other forsaken things.
He himself has become a lost thing now. This is perhaps a mystery initiation? Is he now a nympholept?
At the earliest moment of dawn his impatience awoke him, although one of October's mists hid all glimpses of light. He ate the last of his food and then pushed on through the grayness. No sound from the things of our fields came to him now, for men never went that way when Elfland was there, and none but Alveric went now to that desolate plain. He had travelled beyond the sound of cock-crow from the comfortable houses of men, and was now marching through a curious silence, broken only now and then by the small dim cries of the lost songs that had been left by the ebb of Elfland, and were fainter now than they had been the day before.
Could you save these songs? Could they be stored in some way? Can they crawl into your head and live in your memory?
And when dawn shone, Alveric saw again so great a splendor in the sky, glowing all green low down in the southeast, that he thought once more he saw a reflection from Elfland, and pressed on, hoping to find it over the next horizon. And he passed the next horizon, and still that shingly plain, and never a peak of the pale blue elfin mountains. Whether Elfland always lay over the next horizon, brightening the clouds with its glow, and moved away just as he came, or whether it had gone days or years before, he did not know, but still kept on, and he came at last to a dry and grassless ridge on which his eyes and his hopes had been set for long, and from it he looked far over the desolate flatness that stretched to the rim of the sky, and saw never a sign of Elfland, never a slope of the mountains. Even the little treasures of memory that had been left behind by the ebb were withering into things of our everyday. Then Alvaric drew his magical sword from its sheath. But though the sword had power against enchantment, it had not been given power to bring again an enchantment that was gone, and the desolate land remained the same for all that he waved his sword, stony, deserted, unromantic, and wide. For a little while he went on, but in that flat land the horizon moved imperceptibly with him, and never a peak appeared of the elfin mountains, and on that dreary plain he soon discovered, as sooner or later many a man must, that he had lost Elfland. Chapter 11. The Deep of the Woods. In those days Zerundarel would amuse the boy by charms and by little wonders, and he was content for a while. And then he began to guess for himself, all in silence, where his mother was. He listened to all things said, and thought long about them. And days passed thus, and he only knew she had gone, and still he said never a word of the thing with which his thoughts were busy. And then he came to know, from things said or unsaid, or from looks or glances or wagging of heads, that there was a wonder about his mother's going. But what the wonder was he could not find, for all the marvels that crossed his mind when he guessed. And at last one day he asked Zerundarel. And stored though her old mind was with ages and ages of wisdom, and though she had feared this question, yet she did not know it had dwelt in his mind for days, and could find no better answer out of her wisdom than that his mother had gone to the woods. When the boy heard this, he determined to go to the woods and find her.
So the witch is not merely an old woman who has made herself appear young. She has ages of wisdom. An age is roughly 2,100 years, hence Age of Aries, Age of Pisces, dawning of the Age of Aquarius. If Dunsany is being literal, she has ages and ages of wisdom, so that's at least 8,500 years.
Now in his walks abroad with Zerundarel through the little hamlet of Earl, Orion would see the villagers walking by, and the smith at his open forge, and folk in their doorways, and men that came into the market from distant fields, and he knew them all. And most of all he knew Threl with his quiet feet, and Oth with his lithe limbs, for both of these would tell tales when they met of the uplands and the deep woods over the hill. And Orion on little journeys with his nurse loved to hear tales of far-off places. There was an ancient myrtle tree by a well where Zerundarel would sit in the summer evenings while Orion played on the grass.
Sometimes a myrtle tree is just a tree. The myrtle is sacred to Aphrodite and Demeter. Wreaths of it were used to mark victories that didn't include battle in parts of the classical world.
And Oth would cross the grass with his curious bow, going out in the evening, and sometimes Threl would come, and every time that one of them came, Orion would stop him and ask for a tale of the woods. And if it were Oth, he would bow to Zerundarel with a look of awe as he bowed, and would tell some tale of what the deer did, and Orion would ask him why. Then a look would come over Oth's face, as though he were carefully remembering things that had happened very long ago, and after some moments of silence he would give the ancient cause of whatever the deer did, which explained how they came by the custom.
Is he making high folklore roles here?
If it were Threl that came across the grass, he would appear not to see Zerundarel, and would tell his tale of the woods more hastily in a low voice, and pass on, leaving the evening, as Orion felt, full of mystery behind him. He would tell tales of all manner of creatures, and the tales were so strange that he told them only to young Orion, because, as he explained, there were many folk that were unable to believe the truth, and he did not wish his tales to come to the ears of such. Once Orion had gone to his house, a dark hut full of skins. All kinds of skins hung on the wall, foxes, badgers, and martens, and there were smaller ones in heaps in the corners. To Orion, Thrall's dark hut was more full of wonder than any other house he had ever seen.
Possibly he's telling stories of his high survival roles, or alternatively, area lore.
But now it was autumn, and the boy and his nurse saw Oth and Thrall more seldom, for in the misty evenings, with the threat of frost in the air, they sat no longer by the myrtle tree. Yet Orion watched on their short walks, and one day he saw Thrall going away from the village with his face to the uplands, and he called to Thrall, and Thrall stood still with a certain air of confusion, for he deemed himself of too little account to be clearly seen and noticed by the nurse at the castle, be she witch or woman. And Orion ran to him and said, "Show me the woods." And Zerundarel perceived that the time had come when his thoughts were roaming beyond the lip of the valley, and knew that no spell of hers would hold him long from following after them.
She's able to defy his spells, not, I would say, from magic resistance, but because of his essential nature, which has begun to assert itself.
And Thrall said, "No, my master," and looked uneasily at Zerundarel, who came after the boy and led him away from Thrall. And Thrall went on alone to his work in the deep of the woods. And it was not otherwise than the witch had foreseen, for first Orion wept, and then he dreamed of the woods, and next day he slipped away alone to the house of Oth, and asked him to take him with him when he went to hunt the deer. And Oth, standing on a wide deerskin in front of blazing logs, spoke much of the woods, but did not take him then. Instead, he brought Orion back to the castle, and Zerundarel regretted too late that she had idly said his mother was gone to the woods, for those words of hers had called up too soon that spirit of roving which was bound to come to him, and she saw that her spells could bring content no more.
Is this a passion flaw?
So in the end she let him go to the woods. But not until by lifting of wand and saying of incantation she had called the glamour of the woods down to the nursery hearth, and had made it haunt the shadows that went from the fire and creep with them all over the room, till the nursery was all as mysterious as the forest. When this spell would not soothe him and keep his longing at home, she let him go to the woods.
No information here, just flagging that as a lovely little spell.
He stole away once more to the house of Oth over crisp grass one morning, and the old witch knew he had gone, but did not call him back, for she had no spell to curb the love of roving in man, whether it came early or late. And she would not hold back his limbs when his heart was gone to the woods, for it is ever the way of witches with any two things to care for the more mysterious of the two.
Arguably, this is true of hermetic magi also. It's a good line for an NPC to use.
So the boy came alone to the house of Oth, through his garden where dead flowers hung on brown stalks, and the petals turned to slime if he fingered them, for November was come and the frosts were abroad all night. And this time Orion just met with a mood in Oth, which in less than an hour would have gone, that was favorable to the boy's longing. Oth was taking down his bow from the wall as Orion went in, and Oth's heart was gone to the woods, and when the boy came yearning to go to the woods too, the hunter in that mood could not refuse him. So Oth took Orion on his shoulder and went up out of the valley. Folk saw them go thus, Oth with his bow and his soft noiseless sandals and his brown garments of leather, Orion on his shoulder, wrapped in the skin of a fawn which Oth had thrown round him. And as the village fell behind them, Orion rejoiced to see the houses further and further away, for he had never been so far from them before. And when the uplands opened their distances to the eyes, he felt that he was now upon no mere walk, but a journey. And then he saw the solemn gloom of the wintry woods far off, and that filled him at once with a delighted awe. To their darkness, their mystery, and their shelter, Oth brought him. So softly Oth entered the wood that the blackbirds that guarded it, sitting watchful on branches, did not flee at his coming, but only uttered slowly their warning notes, and listened suspiciously till he passed, and were never sure if a man had broken the charm of the wood. Into that charm and the gloom and the deep silence Oth moved gravely, and a solemnness came on his face as he entered the wood, for to go on quiet feet through the wood was the work of his life, and he came to it as men come to their heart's desire.
I thought Oth had way of the woods, but there's something else going on here. Is this a personality virtue? Or is it perhaps the higher calling virtue?
And soon he put the boy down on the brown bracken and went on for a while alone. Orion watched him go with his bow in his left hand till he disappeared in the wood, like a shadow going to a gathering of shadows and merging amongst its fellows. And although Orion might not go with him now, he had great joy from this, for he knew by the way Oth went and the air he had that this was serious hunting, and no mere amusement made to please a child, and it pleased him more than all the toys he had had. And quiet and lonely the great wood loomed around him while he waited for Oth to return. And after a long while he heard a sound, all in the wonder of the wood, that was less loud than the sound that a blackbird made, scattering dead leaves to find insects, and Oth had come back again. He had not found a deer, and for a while he sat by Orion and shot arrows into a tree, but soon he gathered his arrows and took the boy on his shoulder again and turned homeward. And there were tears in Orion's eyes when they left the great wood, for he loved the mystery of the huge gray oaks, which we may pass by unnoticed, or with but a momentary feeling of something forgotten, some message not quite given, but to him their spirits were playmates. So he came back to Earl as from new companions, and with his mind full of hints that he had from the old wise trunks, for to him each bole had a meaning.
That's a lovely poetic description of the way of the woods virtue.
And Zerundarel was waiting at the gateway when Oth brought Orion back, and she asked little of his time in the woods, and answered little when he told her of it, for she was jealous of them whose spell had lured him from hers. And all that night his dreams hunted deer in the deeps of the wood. Next day he stole away again to the house of Oth, but Oth was away hunting, for he was in need of meat. So he went to the house of Threll, and there was Threll in his dark house amongst manifold skins. "Take me to the woods," said Orion, and Threll sat down in a wide wooden chair by his fire to think about it and to talk of the woods. He was not like Oth, speaking of a few simple things which he knew, of the deer, of the ways of the deer, and of the approach of the seasons. But he spoke of the things that he guessed in the deep of the wood and in the dark of time, the fables of men and of beasts, and especially he cared to tell the fables of the foxes and badgers, which he had come by from watching their ways at the falling of dusk. And as he sat there gazing into the fire, telling reminiscently of the ancient ways of the dwellers in bracken and bramble, Orion forgot his longing to go to the woods, and sat there on a small chair warm with skins, content. And to Threll he told what he had not said to Oth, how he thought that his mother might come one day round the trunk of one of the oak trees, for she had gone for a while to the woods. And Threll thought that that might be, for there was nothing wonderful told of the woods that Threll thought unlikely. And then Zerundarel came for Orion and took him back to the castle, and the next day she let him go to Oth again, and this time Oth took him once more to the wood. And a few days later he went again to Threll's dark house, in whose cobwebs and corners seemed to lurk the mystery of the forest, and heard Threll's curious tales. And the branches of the forest grew black and still against the blaze of fierce sunsets, and winter began to lay its spell on the uplands, and the wiser ones of the village prophesied snow. And one day Orion, out in the woods with Oth, saw the hunter shoot a stag. He watched him prepare it and skin it and cut it into 2 pieces and tie them up in the skin, with the head and horns hanging down. Then Oth fastened up the horns to the rest of the bundle and heaved it onto his shoulder, and with his great strength carried it home. And the boy rejoiced more than the hunter. And that evening Orion went to tell the story to Threll, but Threll had more wonderful stories. And so the days went by, while Orion drew from the forest and from the tales of Threll a love of all things that pertain to a hunter's calling, and a spirit grew in him that was well matched with the name he bore, and nothing showed in him yet of the magical part of his lineage. End of chapter 11. The Deep of the Woods.
And so we bid farewell again to the Vale of Earl. Your saga may vary.